Well, thank you very much. What I want to do this evening is to focus most on what would be a holistic growth agenda. It should be obvious why it's necessary to have that growth agenda, why austerity isn't going to be enough. The statistics that we've heard should be evident. But before getting into this growth agenda, I want to spend just a few minutes giving some, you might say, economics background. The first observation is that markets on their own are not stable. Not only may they create destabilizing bubbles, as they have repeatedly done, most recently with the tech and housing bubble, but once in a downturn, there are forces at play exacerbating the downturn. Unemployment and the fear of it spreading drives down wages, incomes, and consumption, and thus total demand. And there is a process then of a vicious downward circle, and that's what we have to avoid, and that's what Europe is already beginning to get in. The increase of the unemployment, unless something is done, could feed on itself, and the problem could get worse. I think the thing we have to remember is that while markets were very inefficient in allocating resources before the crisis, in the United States they put the money in the wrong way into housing beyond people's ability to afford. But the real waste of resources has occurred since the breaking of the bubble and since the beginning of the crisis. The real waste of resource is the gap between the economy's potential and its actual output. The real waste of resources has to do with the unemployment. One can calculate the loss that has occurred in the United States and Europe since the crisis began in late 2008, and we're talking about trillions of dollars that are essentially wasted. And if we think about what we could do with these trillions, and I say trillions, that's millions of dollars, the world would be so much better. And I think all of us know what we could do with the magnitudes of the money that has been wasted. The human resources, the physical resources, the natural resources that we have today are the same that we had in 2007 and 2008. And the real crime is that we're not using these resources. Markets are not working, and unfortunately, the policies of austerity are not correcting the market failure and are resulting in this persistence of this gap between the economy's potential and what it's actually being produced, with consequences that are particularly severe of those at the bottom, and I'll come to that a little bit later. Given that markets on their own do not work, government needs to play a role. But the wrong policies can make matters worse. States, governments with balanced budget frameworks have to cut back spending as tax revenues fall, which economists describe as an automatic destabilizer. Unfortunately, this is what Europe seems dangerously bent on adopting. And I would urge you to be very careful of going forward with that kind of framework unless you reinterpret it very carefully in the ways that I'll come to later and the ways that probably you'll talk about a little later. I don't want this evening to engage in a blame game of how the crisis started, but I do want to point out that it was not fiscal profligacy that is at the heart of the European crisis. Ireland and Spain had surpluses before the crisis. Ireland and Spain had very low debt-GDP ratios. They did make a mistake. The government did not prevent the financial markets from misallocating capital, allowing a bubble to grow. But it was a market failure. And it was a failure of government to stop the markets from failing in ways that they have failed repeatedly since the beginning of capitalism. The third point I want to raise is that, and let me emphasize this, austerity by itself will not work. And that's already evident in the data. And let me make clear, things will almost certainly get worse. That the austerity that is going on is feeding on itself and bringing down the economy, and the result of that is the improvement in the budget will be disappointing almost everywhere. No large economy, and Europe is a large economy, has ever emerged quickly from a crisis through austerity. There is no historical basis for austerity working. There are a few small countries, mostly with flexible exchange rates, and almost always when their trading partners are having booms, in which austerity has worked, mainly because government cutbacks have been replaced by exports. Canada did this when, in the early 90s, when the United States was having a boom. And it had flexible exchange rates, the exchange rate went down, and they were able to substitute government spending with exports. But this will not happen in Europe, and it will especially not happen given the euro framework that gives you no flexibility. But not only are the other countries in Europe weak, growth in the United States is also weak. And so we really have here a problem of weakness feeding on weakness. So let me repeat, austerity inevitably, predictably on its own makes matters worse. Austerity will not bring about either growth or confidence. It will destroy both, no matter how many speeches are given about the importance of confidence and growth. Those of you who have followed the recent IMF meetings, and people always talk about the importance of confidence and restoring confidence and growth. But it doesn't happen when you pursue policies of austerity that weaken growth and will destroy confidence. This has happened repeatedly. It happened in Latin America. We have people from Latin America here. It happened in East Asia. So this is not the first time people have gone through this experiment. This has happened repeatedly. It is, of course, a little precious to hear these pontifications about restoring confidence from those who are at the helm of central banks, finance ministries, and private banks as they steer the global financial market to the brink of ruin, creating the ongoing financial mess. The fourth point I wanted to emphasize, and that was really mentioned earlier, is the importance of externalities. We live in a very integrated world, so a slowdown in one country has effects on others. The notion of externalities should be clear. When one country, when we used to thinking about it in the context of environment, pollution is an externality. The U.S. polluted the global economy with toxic mortgages. When I talk in Europe, I always thank my European audience for buying so many of our toxic mortgages, because if you hadn't, the downturn in the U.S. would have been much worse. But that's an example of an externality. But an economic slowdown in one country has adverse effects on its neighbors. When the UK slows down, it hurts itself, but it also hurts its trading partners. And what is going on now in Europe is hurting everybody, because as each country in Europe cuts back, it hurts the neighbors, and that reverberates throughout Europe. By the same token, if you stimulate your economy, it benefits your neighbors. If Germany stimulates its economy, it will help its neighbors. And so the benefits of stimulation of growth are received partly by yourself, but also by your neighbors. And the final point I want to make is structural reforms as was said, are important. But we should recognize that they take time and that they are what economists call supply-side measures. Right now, it is demand that is limiting production today. The wrong so-called supply measures, those that lead to lower incomes today, may in fact exacerbate the lack of aggregate demand. And we should understand the limitations of these supply-side measures. The United States has long been touted as having the most flexible labor markets in the world. And yet, we had unemployment that was at 10%. But even today, if you include the disguised unemployment, people who are working part-time, who would like a full-time job, people who've dropped out of the labor force because they've searched and searched and cannot find a job, almost 1 out of 6 Americans who would like a full-time job cannot get one. And the numbers for the youth are even worse. So this is what happens with a flexible labor market. It doesn't solve your problems. It is only through increased growth. Firms won't create new jobs unless there is demand for their products.